Thank you so much for joining me in our study from the book of Revelation down here, chapter 16, verses 17 through 21. We're going to deal with the last of the seven bowls of wrath in this particular study. Very climactic, and I think you'll pick up on that. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. I know it's a difficult study. The book of Revelation, written at least twice, it calls itself mystery language. And so, there's a lot of things about the book of Revelation that is challenging. It takes a mature spirit, somebody who's really willing to dig and to look at some things of God that are not typical to our physical senses, as it were. And yet we know that the book of Revelation, at least twice, the opening chapter and the concluding chapter, it gives a blessing to those who are willing to dig, those who are willing to get after it and study this marvelous piece of material that was given to us directly from our Lord. And so I appreciate you very, very much. I know it's a difficult topic at times, and there are times that it really perhaps is a little more complicated. You're not getting all the answers that you want, et cetera, but we are blessed that we have the maturity to actually get into it and dig, and I appreciate you. Cindy, good to see you down there in Louisiana. I appreciate you for joining me tonight. All right, here's where we were. In chapter 16 and verse 12, we looked at the sixth angel, or at least the beginning. Verse 12 is the beginning of the look at the sixth angel, the next to last angel. And you might recall two major issues here are we're going to dry up the Euphrates River, which will allow the kings from the east access to invade. And a lot of discussion as to who those people are, etc. And nobody knows for sure, but that's what is referred to here in verse 12. And then you're going to follow up by also having these frogs, three frogs that are going to come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, and they are going to be unclean spirits. They are going to then use their power of deception to grab the world, world powers, that is, and to draw them into an alliance that eventually is going to end up in a battle against God and his people at Armageddon. And so that's where we were last time. Okay. Hi, Greg and Marilyn. I appreciate you and love your family so much. Thank you for encouraging me by being a part of our study tonight. Now, that's last time. What I want you to see by way of review is that we have covered now through six of the bowls of wrath, and we're into number 7. And just by way of summary, in number 7, we're going to see that the bowl of wrath is going to be poured out into the air, and it's going to create lightning, thunder, and unparalleled earthquake, and 100-pound hailstones. Those are big hailstones. So here we go. Verse 17, the last paragraph of chapter 16. The seventh angel poured out his bowl. We've made a lot to do about the number 7 in the book of Revelation, and I think rightfully so. Daniel does the same thing. There are many who translate the number 7 to be literal, and so when you get to the idea in Daniel's case, the idea of how long will the tribulation last, they go with a literal number 7. The thing that they also want to attach is it's got to be a literal years. That I'm not so sure. That seems probable, but that's not what Daniel says. Daniel says that there will be 7. Doesn't attach years. He just says 7. Now we, by our own desires and implications, attach 7, and I think reasonably so. But I think you got to be very, very careful. Now, all I'm saying is that as you go to that level of assumption, then you've got to also ask your question, okay, if we don't even know that it's necessarily, Daniel doesn't specifically say 7 years, he just says 7. We assume it's 7 years. Is it possible that the 7 here, even if you're talking about years, is not really referencing a literal 7-year period as much as it's referencing a period of time that is complete? Because that seems to be what the number 7 represents here. So it's possible that the tribulation period is actually just a complete period of time. And about halfway through that complete period of time, we have the demarcation zone between tribulation and great tribulation being God himself inflicting the tribulation upon the world, which we're seeing in the bowls of wrath here. All I'm saying is just be very, very careful as you approach the book of Revelation. You begin to attach all kinds of assumed certainties to the discussion. Will it be 7 years specifically as far as I think it's very possible it could be, but I'm not going to preach it that way because, again, Daniel doesn't say 7 years. It's by the translators that they insert the word years there. All right, I've said enough about that. So we got the seventh angel, and the seventh, again, I think meaning completion. The seventh messenger of God is going to bring, he's going to say himself, God, that is, this is it. We're done. Finish. Kaput. Yeah, I've given all the chances that you're going to get. And we see that he is going to say here in a minute that it's done. So again, the number 7 is emphasized by what God is going to say with the idea of completion. Probably said it too many times, but where do we get the whole idea of 7 being number of completion? It's part of the ancient system. How many days of creation? 7. On what day did God complete it? Was it done? Day number 7. And so from the very beginning, the Jew has understood the number 7 largely to represent completion. Okay? So the 7th angel is going to pour out his bowl, and he's going to pour it out into the air. Now here we're going to find another parallel to the Egyptian plagues of many years ago. In Exodus chapter 9, it's interesting. The Lord is going to tell Moses and Aaron, he's going to say, take handfuls of soot and throw them into the air in the sight of Pharaoh. And when that happens, fine dust fell over all the land of Egypt, and it became boils breaking out and sores on all the people. Now, that's not what's going to result in our 7th bowl of wrath, but it's interesting that back in the day with regards to the plagues, that the same kind of a process was used. It seems, again, that God is, remember in the opening slide where I talked about prophetic parallels? I think that the Egyptian plagues were the microcosm of the macrocosm to come, which is the 7 bowls of wrath. And so, again, you just see God paralleling throughout history. And it's one of the reasons I think that you and I can be confident in the scriptures, because what the scriptures do is they speak in cycles and parallels. And so you're not left to just one passage. There's another passage that's going to moderate this passage. Thus, I get what is my greatest hermeneutic, and that is let the Bible interpret itself. Let the Bible lay the Bible beside the Bible, and in that situation, you allow the Bible to expand upon itself. The Greek word parabole is where we get the word parable. Jesus was the master teacher because one of the things that he did is he would take 2 things, lay them side by side, an Old Testament principle, then he would tell a modern day story to make the Old Testament principle come alive. That's laying 2 things side by side for comparison's sake. I think the same thing is happening here. The Egyptian plagues took place. We lay that down. And now we're seeing in chapter 16, the 7 bowls of wrath. We lay that down. And God is using similarities between the 2 events to help us to appreciate it and to understand it. Here's one of those similarities, and that is handfuls of soot thrown into the air. Here we go. We're going to have a bowl of wrath that's going to be poured into the air. Another similarity. Here are those plagues that I was referencing. Only number 4 seems to be without a parallel in the between the plagues of Egypt and what we have going on in chapter 16 with the bowls of wrath. That's where the sun scorches everybody. We don't seem to have that in the Egyptian plagues. But you can see there's a lot of parallels that God is using from Old Testament already established historical fact that took place, and he's using those, and he's helping them to describe to us what's taking place with regards to the bowls of wrath here. Hi, Mom. I'm sorry that you're hurting so bad. I've been praying for you all day. Please remember my mother in your prayers. All right, so we've got the 7th, the last, the completed 7th angel is going to pour his bowl into the air, and there's going to be a loud voice that is going to come from the temple. So as it's completed, a loud voice comes from the temple. Now I want to back you up to chapter 15 when we actually started this process. Chapter 16 is where you get all 7 of the bowls of wrath are poured out, okay? But it actually is introduced way back in chapter 15. In chapter 15, verse 5, after this I looked, and the sanctuary of the temple of the witness in heaven was open. Verse 6, and out of the sanctuary came 7 angels. We're up to number 7 now. Came 7 angels with 7 plagues. It's an interesting word, very similar to the word that's being used in Egypt, right? 7 plagues. They're clothed in purple, etc. They got other descriptions there. And one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, which we see poured out then in chapter 16, which we're at the end of. And the sanctuary was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the sanctuary until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. It's done. We're dealing with that moment, okay? And so we have the glory of God is going to fill that sanctuary, and nobody can enter it until we get this job done, and that is to pour out the 7 bowls of wrath. Well, we're now at that point. This was several lessons ago, chapter 15, right? Well, now we're in chapter 16, and we're at the point where we are concluding the dumping out of God's fury upon those who refuse to repent. We've seen that also throughout the description of the 7 bowls of wrath, that people refuse to repent. The sad part is you're going to see it again after the very last. People are going to they're going to curse God. The stubbornness, the stiff-neckedness, if that's a word, of the human spirit. And we're going to refuse the Creator who sent his only Son to die for the created. It's done. The voice comes out of the temple from the throne, and it's going to say, it's done. I'm done. It's over. And it's not too far from here. We're actually going to pick up in chapter 19, where we're going to see Jesus is going to come out. He's going to be released, and he's going to have his garments are going to be covered in blood and all of those kind of things. Some other parallels that are taking place with even right within the book of Revelation, I'm confident. So it's done, very similar to what happens at the cross. In fact, the next several statements are going to have a parallel to what took place when Jesus was crucified. You might recall chapter 19 of the book of John. After Jesus, knowing all this and finished, he said to the scriptures, I thirst. They gave him a jar full of wine, and a jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge and they offered it to him. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. Very similar to it is done. It is finished. He bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. And so here in a moment, we're going to see that it's going to say that God remembers Babylon. And Babylon is a representation of all this wickedness. And we're going to see that the holy city is going to be split into thirds. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on here in the 7th bowl that's somewhat reminiscent, where God is finally, it seems like in our estimation, he's taken a lot of time to get here, but God is finally pouring out his vengeance upon those who crucified his son. Later on, individuals who didn't recognize the fact that Jesus was crucified, on and on, It's interesting that we're watching, or we're seeing this play out in front of us, and it's Memorial Day weekend. And I've thought about those who've lost loved ones to war, and how hurt they must be by folks who don't appreciate. Even our vice president, as most of you know, kind of put out a tweet that was disrespectful, it seemed, or at least flippant with regards to this, not even mentioning, just have a good weekend, have a good 3-day weekend, not even mentioning the sacrifice it took to get us here. So she's had to do a lot of backpedaling and makeup because of that mistake that she made. Well, how must it hurt people when they know their son, their daughter lost their life so that I could have a Memorial Day weekend, a 3-day weekend to go to the beach or whatever it may be. And yet I don't even think about their son or their daughter. How horrible must that be? Well, take that now, that little bit of rage that you got working in your heart, and assign it to the heart of God. The Creator died for the created. He withheld his power and allowed them to kill him so that you and I would not have to go to hell and spend eternity away from God. And yet here we are all these many years later, and too many of us don't have enough time to stop and to think about Jesus. Don't have enough time to really reflect upon who Jesus is. I was told recently about a friend I've had in the distant past who said essentially that they didn't believe that they have sinned nearly enough that Jesus needed to go to the cross for them. And I shook my head. I almost wanted to cry. Think of the arrogance of that. Well, if families hurt because their loved one went off to war and never came home in order for you to have a Memorial Day weekend, how must it hurt God that he has been giving you all these wonderful blessings? Sunshine, the sun comes up in the morning, goes down at night, you hear the birds tweet, all of that. He's giving you all these blessings, and yet you don't stop to reflect and think about him. I think that what we're seeing here is the end. It's done. And the ultimate vengeance of God upon those who refuse to appreciate Jesus and what he did at the cross when he went so far to do it all and say, it's finished. It's not just that it's done, but we continue reading. We find there were flashes of lightning. There's going to be rumblings, peals of thunder, and great earthquakes, such as there never had been since man was on the earth. So great that it was that earthquake. The great city was split into three parts. We've all experienced thunderstorms, flashes of lightning, and it almost blinds you for a second. You've heard it kind of rumble in the distance, and you know that it's coming, and it just gets louder and louder, almost like a freight train, as it's coming through the living room, kind of a thing. People say that about tornadoes and storms of this nature. Well, can you imagine in this situation, as we're seeing now, it's done, I'm finished. And with that, there's this ultimate climax of wrath. And we've got the flashes of lightning and the peals of thunder. And then it all culminates in this great earthquake. An earthquake that's never been experienced like that since humanity was on the planet, he says. And this earthquake is going to be so terrible, it's actually going to split the great city into three parts. Now, again, I'm playing trying to stay in between the two things here. Are we dealing with symbolism here? Are we dealing with literalism here? I don't know. But what I do know is that whatever is being communicated is something that we are supposed to take literal as a principle in our heart. And the principle is this: the great city, most folks believe that's got to be Jerusalem. The great city is divided into three parts. Why three? I don't know. It seems to be the divine number, so perhaps it has something to do with God. But it's divided into three parts because of the wrath of God that he has unleashed upon the world. That's how great this earthquake is. Matthew 27, again, another parallel to the time when Jesus was crucified. You might recall that he cried out with a loud voice, yielded up his spirit, and behold, the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That was a massive moment when the curtain between the holy place and the holy of holies was actually torn in two. And the earth shook and the rocks were split. Great earthquake took place when Jesus was on the cross. Now, this earthquake evidently was not as powerful as this earthquake, because this one actually says that such there had never been since man was on the earth, so great was the earthquake. So it had, and this is written later. And so this is going to be an even more intense earthquake. Excuse me, like my sneezing earthquake there. But Jesus, we got that parallel again between what Jesus has experienced. We've got earthquakes. We've got it's done. So several parallels between the crucifixion moment and what's taking place now in this final bowl of wrath that's being dumped out upon the world. Now we deal with Babylon. Let's see if I can take that off. So the great city was split in three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And so it doesn't just affect Jerusalem. This is going to be something that the nations are going to. It's the last one. The world's crumbling. The world's literally it's imploding. I think that's the word I'm trying to say. And watch what God's going to do here. So the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon. Now that doesn't mean he had a warm fuzzy in his heart. It's not like, oh, I remember back in the day. That's not what this is. This is God remembered. God has a record in his mind of the folks who are not as they should be, and have continued even through the seven bowls of wrath. They have continued to refuse to repent. He's got a record in his mind, and Babylon references the catalyst of all of that rebellion against him. God remembers that. And notice what he's going to do. God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury. You remember back in the day when you and your buddies were out and you were, who knows, Kool-Aid or whatever. I never was one to drink alcohol and that kind of thing, but you remember when you were playing around and somebody said, hey, can you finish it? And they hand you the big bottle and you whatever it may be, and you chug-a-lugging as much as you can. I used to love to chug-a-lug Hawaiian punch, but after a while, it doesn't matter how much you love the substance. After a while, there's just too much. They say milk is one of those things. They got the milk challenge. There's a certain amount of milk that you get it inside your system and your system can't handle it. It's coming back out. Well, that's kind of the idea of what we have here. It's God is so fed up at this particular point. We're seeing the graphic nature of his wrath and vengeance being poured out, that it says that Babylon, he remembers Babylon, and he remembers what Babylon represents, and he's going to make Babylon drain the cup. Bottoms up. No stopping, all of it, down the throat. And so Babylon is going to drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. It's probably one of the most graphic descriptions of God's anger in all of the Bible. Here's the passage that I wanted to parallel with that, chapter 17, which is coming up. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated, and the people and the multitudes and the nations and language. We've got the nations mentioned here too. Okay, we got the nations and the nations fell. Okay, the nations and language. And the 10 horns that you saw, they are the beast. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. Okay, that's going to be Babylon. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put into their hearts to carry out his purpose, which is this whole idea of drain the cup, being of one mind and handling over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. So the woman that you saw is the great city of Babylon. And the idea is that she is the one who is led in a seductive, prostitute-like way. She has led the kingdoms of the world out against God, against his principles. And we're seeing that play out. I mean, we have throughout history, but we're certainly seeing that play out during our time as well. Individuals, world powers that are leading the charge against the values of God. Unfortunately, some of that's happening right here in America. Again, I want to remind you of the parallels between the plagues of Egypt and the bowls of wrath, because when you get down here to verse 20, notice what's going to happen. Every island is going to flee, or is fled away, and no mountains were to be found. So the world is just an upheaval, major upheaval, and great hailstones. Okay, hailstones, that's a parallel to what took place in Egypt. It was one of the plagues, right? And great hailstones, which weighed about 100 pounds, are falling from the sky. Can you imagine? 100-pound hailstones are pelting the earth. I mean, the other day we had a hailstorm that came through here just briefly, and it tore up one of the screens on my window. And I thought, oh man, and it can tear up a roof, it can tear up the cars. You know what hail can do. Can you imagine what a 100-pound hailstone could do? Well, horrible time, and it fell from heaven on the people. But watch this: they cursed God. What does it take? At what point are you willing to submit and say, I'm wrong? I take responsibility. I can't win. God, you are almighty. I am without power to even compete against you. I surrender. At what point does it evidently there are many who will never get there. And they're going to be thrown into the pit right along with the great red dragon. And it's going to be sealed over, and we'll never see them no more, because they are so stubborn in their ways, so prideful that they wouldn't say I'm sorry, so prideful that they couldn't acknowledge that they had made a mistake. They cursed God even after seeing 100-pound hailstones falling out the heavens. There's your snowstorm, so that means we're done. So, as we review, and here are your 5 questions with regards to this particular concluding paragraph from chapter 16, just remember that as we climax this with the 7th angel and the voice from heaven saying it's done, we are now entering into the final section of the book of Revelation. And we still have a chapter yet, because we've got to describe how Babylon does fall. Remember that last passage? Let's see if I throw it up here. Right there. 17. Yeah, right here, chapter 17. That's the next thing we're dealing with, okay? Which is going to be somewhat of an expansion. It's going to be an expanded description. That's a good way to put it. An expanded description of Babylon draining the cup. We're going to see what happens to Babylon in chapter 17. And then as we move on into chapter 18 and then chapter 19, things are really heating up with regards to the end. Okay. Now we're not quite to that yet, because when we get to the endings, that's when God starts putting finality to it. There's no more time to repent. The great dragon is going to be thrown. Satan himself is going to be thrown into the pit, along with the false prophet, etc. And then those who had the mark of the beast, they were going to go there. The pit is going to be closed up, sealed over. It's done, and so we've got the endings. And then we enter into chapters. What is that? 21 and 22. Yeah, that's the good stuff, because those are the new beginnings. Okay, but move on back through here. Let's move. There you go. So there's your 5 questions. That's what we dealt with the 7 bowls of wrath. Next time we will enter into chapter 17 and we'll begin to see the fall of Babylon and the description that is given with regards to that. So thankful to have you join me. It really means a lot. This is Sonny Chow saying, be there. Matthew 16:26.